They say there are names carved into the soil of America that were never meant to be remembered. Names whispered in taverns, hidden in court records, and buried beneath the fields where bones still rot. Patty Cannon is one of those names. If you stay with me, you will learn why her legacy is far darker than even the history books dare admit. Imagine this. A plow horse jolts suddenly in the spring of 1829, hooves collapsing into soft ground. The farmer curses, pulls at the reins, and then realizes he's uncovered something more sinister than broken earth. Wooden chest, heavy, weathered. Locked in the soil like a coffin, they crack it open, and the stench of death rushes out. Inside bones. Human bones. The skull fractured, teeth grinning through soil-stained jawlines. This was not an accident of burial. This was violence. Deliberate. A secret that refused to stay underground. But here's the truth you were never meant to know. This was not the first chest, nor the last. They unearthed 7 bodies in total, including children's small skulls, tiny ribs, the unmistakable evidence of innocence destroyed. And every single one of them was tied back to a woman who had been walking freely among her neighbors, running a tavern, smiling at passersby, hiding her empire of terror in plain sight. Her name was Martha Patty Cannon. To the locals, she was just another tough widow, but in reality, she was the mastermind of what became known as the reverse Underground Railroad network that captured free black men. Women and children chained them, broke them, and sold them south into bondage. This was not a single act of cruelty. This was a system, a machine, business built on blood. And yet, here's what no textbook tells you. She didn't just trade in flesh. She killed. She killed rivals, witnesses, children, anyone who threatened to expose her empire. The law barely touched her. The community protected her with silence. And for almost 2 decades, she operated with impunity, stepping across state lines, bribing sheriffs, and burying her victims in fields that are still stained with their screams. This is not just history. This is revelation.
Us.
A story scrubbed clean for polite society, hidden because it reveals something America cannot face, that power does not rest with the law. Or with morality, it rests with those who know how to use fear, corruption, and silence. Patty Cannon understood that. She turned it into an art of domination. You're not just hearing about a woman, you're hearing about the architecture of hidden power. Once you see it, you will never unsee. In the days that followed the first whisper of the Higgins family's disappearance, the town itself seemed to breathe differently. Selburne, England, 1965. An otherwise unremarkable village with cobbled streets and faded ash. Stone cottages now held its silence too tightly. The neighbors spoke in low tones. Curtains were drawn earlier than usual. It was as if the air had thickened, with some invisible weight, the kind that presses against your chest, reminding you that something unnatural has taken root. The Higgins family was not wealthy, nor particularly eccentric. By all outward appearances, they were ordinary. The father, John Higgins, worked as a tradesman. His wife, Margaret, was known for her quiet nature, and their 3 children blended into the background of school and church life. No scandals, no obvious enemies, no known secrets. And yet an entire household vanished without leaving even the smallest breadcrumb. Their dinner plates were still set on the table. The kettle had been left to cool, half filled. A chair was toppled over, but no signs of forced entry. Some locals claimed they heard shouting that night, muffled urgent voices, but no one dared check until morning. By then, the house stood still, the rooms chillingly undisturbed, as if frozen in time. The police arrived, but even they seemed reluctant, hesitant to tread too deeply into the case. Their reports were vague, filled with hedged phrases like unconfirmed and inconclusive. But those who lived closest to the Higgins home began noticing something stranger, an unease that clung to their dreams. Shadows lingered where they shouldn't. Dogs barked furiously at the empty house. Lamps flickered in windows where no one remained. It wasn't merely absence, it was presence. The kind of presence that doesn't want to be explained. And then came the whispers. Children walking home from school swore they heard voices, calling from inside the Higgins residence, soft, almost pleading voices. Yet every search revealed nothing but dust and silence. One constable who conducted a night patrol claimed he saw movement inside, but when he pushed open the door, the room stood empty. His official statement was scrubbed from the record. Here, the truth begins to uncoil. Was this merely a disappearance? Or was the Higgins family erased? And if erased, by whom or by what? The Higgins family was not like other families in 1960s England. To outsiders, they appeared polite, ordinary, even forgettable. But behind the walls of their modest brick home, things were different. Neighbors whispered that the family rarely interacted with others, that they spoke in hushed tones, and that their curtains were always drawn. Even on the brightest summer afternoons, those who lived nearby recalled unsettling details. A soft humming late at night, flickers of light in the upstairs windows long after midnight, and sometimes the sound of unfamiliar voices low, murmuring conversations that could not be placed. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher, claimed she once saw 4 men in dark suits entering the Higgins house at dawn. Strangers, foreign-looking, she said. They carried no briefcases, no bags, nothing but themselves. Leave the house for hours. When they finally emerged, they walked with synchronized steps, their eyes fixed straight ahead, ignoring everyone around them. No one in the neighborhood ever saw them again. What disturbed people even more was the Higgins family's strange behavior after these visits. The children stopped playing outside. The parents grew pale and thin, as if drained. Conversations with them became bizarrely fragmented. When asked simple questions, "How are you? Will you be attending church this Sunday?" answered with riddles, half-finished sentences, or sometimes with silence.
I'm ready.
It was as though something was inside their home, or worse, inside their minds. But here's where it gets darker. When local authorities were later pressed for answers after the family's disappearance, every record of official visits to their home was missing. No police files, no social services reports, nothing. As though the family had never required attention, never raised suspicion. Yet multiple neighbors claimed they remembered officers visiting at least twice. Were those visits erased? Or did the authorities know something too dangerous to reveal? This is where the Higgins case begins to slip from mystery into conspiracy. Because the whispers that followed weren't about ghosts or folklore, they were about experiments. Quiet projects run in the shadows of England's institutions. Families chosen, observed, then erased. The Higgins family may not have been victims of chance. They may have been participants, whether willingly or not, in something much larger and much darker. The whispers did not remain whispers for long. By autumn of 1847, the Utah Territory settlement was thick with suspicion. Neighbors no longer looked one another in the eye. Doors were bolted earlier. The church bells rang hollow, as if the iron itself knew that something unholy was spreading through the valley. And at the center of it all stood Mr. Whitmore. It began with the wives. For women, bound not only to him, but seemingly to a vow of silence that none dared to break. Their presence was unsettling, not because they spoke lies, but because they barely spoke at all. At the market, they were seen standing together, their eyes vacant, as if rehearsing some private code. Witnesses swore they moved in perfect synchronicity, each mirroring the gestures of the others. One woman tying her shawl would trigger another to do the same. It was not natural. It was ritual. The townsfolk began to notice patterns that clawed at the edges of reason. Every 7th night, a lantern burned from Whitmore's upper window until dawn. No man in town dared approach, for strange cries could be heard rising from within. Not screams, not laughter, but a sound somewhere between chanting and weeping. Horses reared at the fence line, refusing to move closer as if instinct itself rejected the house. And then came the incident at the church. On a rain-swept Sunday morning, the congregation gathered as always, men on one side, women on the other. Whitmore sat in the front pew, his wives behind him. When the preacher opened the good book, something happened that no one present ever forgot. All 4 wives stood simultaneously, their voices rising in a single, piercing wail. It was not a hymn. It was not English. Some said it sounded older than scripture, older than language itself. The preacher dropped his Bible. Half the congregation fled in terror. From that day forward, the settlement turned against itself. Some swore Whitmore was a prophet. Others believed he was the devil's chosen vessel. The sheriff refused to act, for he too had seen the wives' eyes black pools reflecting nothing, not even the lamplight. Suspicion gave way to fear, and fear to something far worse: obedience. It was no longer Whitmore who followed the laws of the town, it was the town that bent to his. By the spring of 1847, the Whitmore household was no longer just an oddity, had become an institution. For wives moving as one, obeying a single man who claimed divine sanction, and children being raised in a system that blurred the line between family and cult. Outsiders who came near their homestead in Utah Territory spoke of an atmosphere that clung to the place, a heaviness in the air. The eerie silence of the children, trained to keep their eyes low, their mouths closed, and their questions buried. But something shifted that year. The balance began to tilt. Like all systems built on control, cracks began to form where no one thought to look. So the first sign came when one of the wives' historians are divided on which was seen walking alone at night across the barren fields. Witnesses described her as if she were sleepwalking, her pale figure drifting like a ghost in the moonlight. Some swore she was whispering to herself, muttering words that were not in English, not in any language they could recognize. Others claimed they heard her sobbing softly, only to watch her face twist into laughter moments later. When she was confronted, she denied everything. She smiled with the cold obedience expected of her, and said she had been ill, that the night walks were only attempts to clear her head, yet behind her eyes, the seed of rebellion or madness had taken root. It was also in this year that the children began to act strangely. Neighbors recorded chilling details in their journals. The children standing in rigid circles in the yard, their arms extended, chanting in unison. The eldest boy cutting strange patterns into the dirt with a sharpened stick. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the youngest girl, no more than 5, pointing to strangers on the road and calmly declaring how and when they would die. Were these children merely mimicking the rituals they saw in their household? Something darker had been planted in them by Mr. Whitmore himself. The unsettling truth is this: every witness account from that period suggests the family was no longer just unusual, but unnatural. This was the turning point, though no one realized it at the time. The household had shifted from secrecy to something far more dangerous. The family was beginning to slip from the realm of eccentricity into the abyss of the inexplicable. And yet the outside world remained silent, because to speak against Mr. Whitmore was to risk exile, ruin, or worse. What is most terrifying is not what the Higgins family did in those final days, but what the authorities chose to ignore. You see, disappearances in England were not unusual in 1965. Families left, debts forced relocation, fathers abandoned wives, and mothers abandoned children. But this was different. The Higgins family left behind everything: clothing, valuables, food still fresh in the cupboards. Their house was not the scene of a hurried escape, it was the scene of a family that was erased. And yet, the police reports were deliberately softened. Witness statements were rewritten. A neighbor who swore she saw men in black coats carrying trunks into the Higgins home at night, her words vanished from the official files. Another resident who claimed he saw government officials combing the street 2 nights before the disappearance was quickly silenced. What does that tell you? It tells you this wasn't simply a missing persons case. It was a controlled erasure, sanctioned by institutions that thrive on secrecy. The Higgins were not victims of chance, but of design. And here's where it grows even darker, because those same institutions hold a kind of silent agreement: never expose the machinery of control. When entire families vanish, when children are removed from history, When neighbors are threatened into silence, it isn't chaos, it's order. A hidden order, ask yourself. Why are there families that vanish without a trace, yet no archives, no textbooks, no newspapers preserve their memory? Why does history allow some tragedies to live forever and others to be swallowed whole? Because history itself is a weapon. And the Higgins family, whatever they knew, whoever they were tied to, was a threat to the narrative. So they were removed, quietly, efficiently, permanently. What remains is a haunting vacuum, a silence engineered by power. The most unsettling truth is this: if such things could happen in 1965, how many times has it already happened? In your lifetime, right under your nose? The Higgins house was not just a residence, it was a stage. Every room carried traces of a performance carefully arranged for unseen eyes. The parlor contained half-burned candles, even though no one recalled them being lit. The dining table had been reset multiple times, as if the family had rehearsed a ritual meal but never eaten it. In the upstairs hallway, mirrors had been turned to face the walls, a symbolic act often used by secret societies to ward off wandering spirits or prevent something from looking back. Neighbors remembered that on the last night anyone saw the family, faint music drifted from the house, though no musician was ever identified. Some swore it was organ music, others insisted it was more like chanting. Either way, the sound ceased abruptly at midnight, and silence fell so heavy that even the dogs refused to bark. The following morning, a milkman discovered the front door ajar. No sign of forced entry, no struggle. Yet every Higgins child's bed was made as if untouched. Every personal belonging from boots to books remained in place. The family had not packed or fled. They had vanished into thin air. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Records reveal that the house had been visited just 2 weeks prior by a traveling group calling themselves the Circle of the Veil. Officially, they were nothing more than eccentric spiritualists, dabbling in seances and experiments with magnetism. But some researchers whisper they were fronts for something far older in order, intent on mapping the boundaries between life and death. Was the Higgins family a willing part of this, or were they chosen as unwilling subjects? The details suggest something orchestrated, something staged to look like a disappearance but meant for another purpose entirely. Every locked door, every snuffed candle, every mirror turned to the wall. These were not random acts. They were marks of preparation. The most chilling question remains: preparation for what? The further one peers into the Higgins mystery, the more the shadows seem to multiply. Every corner of the story births new questions, and none of them have ever been given a satisfactory answer. It is not only the disappearance itself that unsettles investigators, it is the trail of silence that followed. Why did the neighbors, who claimed to hear strange sounds from the Higgins home for weeks before they vanished, suddenly retract their statements? Why did the local authorities, once eager to publicize the case, abruptly go quiet after only a month of fruitless searching? And most disturbing of all, why were government agents seen combing the area long after the police declared the case closed? Some whispered that the Higgins family stumbled upon something forbidden, an artifact, a document, or perhaps a knowledge that powerful hands wanted buried. Others believed they had become unwilling participants in a social experiment, tested by forces masquerading as science, but in reality, devoted to psychological control. These theories, however wild they seem, align disturbingly with patterns found in other so-called unsolved cases from the mid-20th century. Families erased, documents burned, witnesses silenced. The unanswered questions do not merely haunt history, they expose its fragility. If one family can vanish without explanation, what does that mean for the rest of us? It means the ground beneath our feet is not as solid as we believe. It means the reality we accept may itself be curated, sculpted by unseen powers to keep us compliant. This is why the Higgins story matters, not just because of its tragedy, but because of its implications. Their absence is a mirror, forcing us to ask how many more stories were stolen before they could ever be told. How many disappearances were rewritten into convenient lies? The Higgins family is gone, but the questions they left behind refused to die. By the early 1900s, whispers of the Seven Sisters had spread far beyond Selkirk. Some said they had been victims of a secret order. Others claimed they had been taken as experiments in a science the public was not allowed to know about. Yet what strikes the careful researcher most is not what was said, but what was not. Every town keeps records. It's births, deaths, marriages, property transfers. But when investigators, both amateur and official, tried to trace the Seven Sisters, something chilling happened. Entire pages of local records were missing. Parish books had whole sections torn out. School registers that should have held their names were replaced with blank lines. The church itself, the supposed guardian of truth and history, dismissed all inquiries, calling the sisters' disappearance a family matter best left to memory. And yet, how can 7 young women vanish without a single trace of acknowledgement? How can newspapers that reported on every small theft, every barn fire, every wandering vagrant, suddenly grow silent on the most sensational disappearance the region had ever seen? Unless, of course, silence was ordered. It is here that the shadow of institutional manipulation reveals itself. For the same year, the sisters disappeared. A group of officials from Edinburgh were quietly granted access to the Selkirk Parish archives. Soon after, the gaps appeared. Was this a coincidence or a coordinated purge of evidence? The people who lived in Selkirk knew. They whispered that the sisters had seen something, or perhaps were something that the authorities needed buried. Villagers told of a fire in the woods that burned for 3 days without consuming a single tree, of figures in black cloaks walking the moors at night, of cries echoing from beneath the church floorboards long after the building was closed. But no one dared speak too loudly. Because anyone who pressed too far, anyone who asked too many questions, soon found themselves ruined or disappeared themselves. The disappearance of the Seven Sisters was not merely a tragedy, it was a demonstration, a warning from those who control the flow of history. Records can be altered, memories can be erased. What is called truth can be manufactured. And so Selkirk remained silent, or at least it seemed to, because buried deep within a forgotten collection of private diaries sealed away in an attic for more than a century, fragments of the true story survived. Fragments that reveal why the Seven Sisters had to be erased. Fragments that lead us into the most disturbing revelation of all. The case of the Higgins family remains sealed in layers of silence. No bodies, no graves, no answers. Just an absence that gnaws like an open wound in the history of 1965 England. And yet, the absence itself is the loudest evidence. Neighbors swore they saw movement in the house long after the police declared it empty. Curtains shifting, candle burning late. At night, a figure passing by the window, but when officers broke down the door, the home was hollow, stripped of life. Government documents from the time, if you search hard enough, show blacked out pages. Testimonies crossed out with ink, entire reports marked classified. Why would a missing family in rural England require censorship at the highest levels? Unless the Higgins knew something. Unless their disappearance wasn't a tragedy, but a removal. Those who dared to dig deeper paid a price. A local journalist who published a column questioning the official story was found hanging in his own shed weeks later. His death was ruled a suicide. But his wife swore to her dying day he had no rope, no ladder, and no reason. Another investigator, a private detective hired by distant relatives, vanished while traveling by train to London. His briefcase filled with notes on the Higgins case was found on the platform. He was not. This pattern is what makes the Higgins story different. From ordinary vanishings, it wasn't just a family that disappeared, it was the truth itself. Every trace of inquiry, every voice that asked why, was erased, silenced, or buried under ridicule. It's the method of institutions that fear exposure. Remove the inconvenient piece, and reality adjusts itself to cover the gap. But reality cannot stay patched forever. Whispers still crawl across message boards. Old police officers mutter to their grandchildren. The few torn records rescued from fire before they could be destroyed suggests something more sinister: the Higgins family might have been part of an experiment. An experiment no one was supposed to survive. So here we are, decades later, staring into the hollow outline where 5 lives should be. Were they victims of a cult, test subjects of a hidden program, or simply the unlucky witnesses of something forbidden? We may never know, and perhaps that's the point, because some stories are not lost, they are buried. Buried because if you dig too far, you risk joining the silence yourself.